All right. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since the Rational Standard YouTube channel has broadcast anything. I'm Martin van Staden. I am the editor-in-chief of the Rational Standard, and I want to welcome you all to this live stream. And those of you who are going to watch it a bit later, I am joined by David Ansara, known primarily in South Africa for his running. And Dr. Morné Malan, known for his academic overachievement. And yeah, I mean, if you're joining us now or a bit later, please subscribe to this channel and keep an eye on development because we're planning a few exciting things. And we really want to share our insights, the insights of some people who aren't joining us right now, just about what's going on in South Africa primarily, but also around the world. Yeah, from a little bit more of an irreverent perspective, we don't want to give you clinical cold news necessarily, but just have discussions which eventually we hope you guys will participate in real time. And yeah, just share those insights and talk about anything really that might be interesting and might be useful to people in their daily lives. So yeah, it's a new day, it's a new revolution, not only in the world, not only in South Africa, but also here for us at the Rational Standard, and it's quite exciting. But yeah, without further ado, I mean, talking about revolutions, on Monday, something notable is happening in the United States, I would say. Donald Trump is being inaugurated for his second term. And of course, as we know, Ross Ulbricht will be freed on day one, as Mr. Trump promised. So we're definitely going to hold him to that. And we hope his constituents in the US do exactly the same. It's time for Mr. Ulbricht to be let free. So yeah, exciting times.
Yeah, and Mr. Ulbricht.
What's the over under on second of how many terms are we on Trump? You reckon?
Well, yeah, I mean, God Emperor Donald Trump, I guess. Yeah, it would be the second of 15, maybe.
Well, yeah. I suppose if you've got the whole dynasty where you've got to work through, you've got Don Jr. Actually, Barron might just overtake everyone. He's got his suitcase and everything.
Yeah, he's becoming a bit of a superstar. I'm not quite sure why.
It's interesting how his reputation has grown, and yet he doesn't say very much. Like, there's very few instances of him actually. I wonder if that's a deliberate strategy, just to sort of. I mean, I remember what's his name, Jared Kushner, also had an approach like that. Like, he was deliberately inscrutable but actually was doing a lot of heavy lifting foreign policy work in the Middle East behind the scenes. Yeah, actually, in terms of, I don't know if you've heard like this term, the vibe shift, but actually I think something that was really revealing about the Trump administration and also like the distortion of media narratives was that interview that he did on Lex Friedman's show, the Jared Kushner did, where he really went into a lot of detail about some of the work that he'd done with the Abraham Accords. I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, if you had to open the New York Times on any given day, you would have seen, like a lot of very skeptical commentary around Kushner. Like he's just this sort of billionaire playboy who's just kind of pretending to be a foreign policy wonk, whereas actually some of his achievements were much more notable than anything the State Department or other foreign policy academics have been able to achieve in decades.
Yeah. Actually, whilst we're talking about the vibe shift, I think there's definitely a difference between, and Martin and I actually talked about this earlier the week as well. There's definitely a different sense just surrounding the entire atmosphere with the second Trump term than there was with the 2016 term. After the 2016 election, there was still very much a sense of, we need to resist and we need to fight and, all those sorts of things. Whereas now it's almost as though everybody sort of consigned themselves or resolved that, I guess it wasn't as bad as we thought, which is already kind of weird. Is you got this very heated rhetoric, and then after the election, it's well, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the important thing. It's like the election rhetoric was the same as in 2016. I mean, almost precisely the same. It's like Hitler is back and Madison Square Garden and whatever. It's like it's the end times, and he's going to end democracy and so on. And listen, let me just preface it. I'm not by no means a Trump fan. I'm not. Don't see me as defending this guy who I think has some pretty terrible policies, but. The rhetoric was the same. It's the end times. But whereas in 2016, it seemed to continue after he was inaugurated, now it actually seems like to some degree he's being treated as just another US president, which is interesting. You have Democrats going to meet him at Mar-a-Lago. You have people like Mark Zuckerberg and so on. When they speak about him, about the president, the new incoming president, it's not in terms of him being a fascist dictator, but of we're going to work with the president and so on. So it's actually quite interesting how this works.
Yeah, even that sort of kind of knee-jerk thing that you just did, where you say, "Don't mistake me for a MAGA moron" or something. Even that's sort of a holdover from the previous. That's something you had to say at a time. Whereas now I feel as though it's not really necessary. I think you had to, in the past, or at least in the previous term, there was the sense that even if you voted for Trump, you had to kind of lie about it and say no. And, I'm just kidding. I didn't really.
I would have voted for Chase Oliver, so I have no kind of qualms here. So.
I think now actually we have the opposite of that. I think there are people saying that I voted for Trump. It's definitely, make America great again, and they didn't actually vote for Trump. They're just trying to climb on the new bandwagon.
It's like all those people who never supported apartheid in South Africa.
Yes. Yeah. No. We never voted that, and even now you have a lot of people who are like, no, I didn't vote ANC, but they're doing the best that they can. It's like, well, you probably voted ANC. So
sorry to interrupt you there, Martin.
No. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction, was just it's a difficult time for libertarians and classical liberals. It's never not a difficult time for us, but again, it's a matter of so Donald Trump won the election, and maybe it's better than what a Harris administration would have been. Maybe in a lot of ways it's better, but still, he's now promised that he's going to create another IRS for external revenue service. So he's by no means the small government kind of conservative that I think a lot of people want very much to portray him as. And I guess for a libertarian, I guess it's to some degree important to say, listen, it's relative. And I mean, none of us voted in the US election, but the importance of what the American president does and the American administration does kind of transcend any consideration of who voted for him and who didn't vote for him. It's kind of quite important to us in South Africa, I would say, especially given our attacks on Israel and our bullish relationship with Russia. So I think all of that is going to become very relevant. I mean, it's probably worth saying that it's probably going to be worse for us under Trump, because Harris probably would have taken a knock for South Africa and wouldn't have punished us too harshly. But I think Trump would say, listen, either align yourselves a little bit better with American foreign policy, or you're going to lose out. So,
what do you mean by us? Who's the us that you're referring to, Martin?
Us. I mean the South African government, DIRCO, and the people who speak for us. I should say.
I think there has been a lot of, seeing as we're on the rational standard, I think there has been, particularly on the part of libertarians and maybe classical liberals generally, there has probably been a bit of irrational exuberance. I think, people are maybe making a bit more of it of this than the election than there really is, particularly on the economic front. There is a sort of culture. The culture wars have taken over everything else, and the coalition is, if in the past there was a three-legged stool of conservatism under Reagan, I think now it's sort of a one-legged stool where you just have to be anti-woke, and then you're one of the good guys. And
What
it's sort
were
of
the
a global
three
phenomenon
legs
as well.
for our audience? What were the three legs?
You see, I didn't mention them because I couldn't quite recall. It was free
It was
markets.
Christian. It was the Christian conservatives, the libertarians, and the neocons. Wasn't that the kind of?
Yeah, that's the three-legged stool. Basically, the fusionism, basically, of
Yes,
conservative values with libertarian or free market economics, and and then fairly, I think it was, what
hawkish
was it?
foreign policy.
And hawkish foreign policy was the thing.
But it's interesting because, like, a lot of the commentary around Trump has drawn analogies to the Reagan era. Like, it's a new day, it's morning in America, new golden age, and like similar preconditions. If you think of the Carter presidency, like rampant inflation, crisis in the Middle East, diminishing American power, kind of lack of self-confidence, and then Reagan is that shift. But actually, like you point out, Morné, like the underlying, the kind of broader alliance that Trump has forged is actually quite different. It's actually like a working class alliance. There's this kind of like skepticism of globalization. What I also find kind of contradictory is the sort of the tilt of Silicon Valley towards Trump. Like, if you think of like the chaps from the All In podcast, now David Sachs is the crypto czar, Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, the angel investor, venture capitalist. He's spending half of his time in Mar-a-Lago advising Trump, and also, of course, Elon Musk as well. It's one of those key figures.
Elon's in a trailer on Mar-a-Lago somewhere, isn't it? I feel like I read that somewhere, where he's sort of moved in a trailer on the Mar-a-Lago lawn somewhere.
Hopefully it's like a super futuristic electric powered
I'm sure he's not
Tesla kind of
roughing it.
trailer.
I'm sure he's fine.
No. It's going to be more of an RV, I would say, probably.
He's South African, so I suppose he enjoys a bit of camping, and probably got a little Weber
corrugated iron.
And Clippies and Coke maybe as well to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Musk, it's I guess you haven't seen much of this kind of like the proximity to the president of someone like this in quite a while. So I mean, this morning he's a billionaire, multi-billionaire. And one of his pride and joy Starship explodes on re-entry. And he goes on Twitter and he tweets about, "Oh, look how beautiful it looks! How my exploded spaceship is coming back into orbit." And it's like he doesn't have this kind of corporate vibes around him. So I mean, it's a far more informal. It's more of an open presidency. I almost want to say what would be the appropriate term for it. There's the access of people into how Trump works and how he thinks and so on through people like Musk and like these. David mentioned the crypto guy. I mean, some of these are just kind of ordinary people who have some passion project, and now they're suddenly in a position of intense influence. So I mean, it seems new. I don't know if there's been something like this before, but the way that Trump is going about organizing his government seems new to me.
Yeah, and the other, I mean, we sort of alluded to it earlier, but if you look at not only policy-wise, but also in terms of the appointments he's making and the people he's approaching as sort of cabinet members and advisors and those sorts of things, it's actually a really broad ideological stroke of people, and it's weird that you have maybe it's sort of changing now, but in America you have this weird convergence of policy and a divergence of rhetoric, where people are getting closer and closer to one another in terms of what they say they want to do legislatively, and yet they're ramping up the rhetoric even more. And I also can't think of any similar scenario, but I think it's sort of, you can attribute it to the fact that, and it's sort of a positive on Trump's side, I suppose, definitely a negative as well, but I think, he has no convictions, he has no real ideals. I think anybody that can convince him, I mean, he sort of has a gut feeling with some things. I think, he has a gut sense that he wouldn't like to be entangled in foreign affairs and those sorts of things. But for the most part, I think his guiding principle is basically just, I'd like us to win. And, if you can convince him that a particular policy would get, America winning, then he'll go for it. I mean, we sort of saw that on the visa thing, the H-1B visa stuff, where he actually angered quite a bit of his base by saying, no, we should definitely, they are smart people, we're educating them, we should get their skills.
Okay. Did Trump actually come around and say that? Because I remember Elon was saying that, but did he lend support to that? Yeah, because I think that's an interesting schism within this America First movement. Is I think there's some people who like Vivek. I mean, if you think about it, he's like the son of immigrants, like a businessman, a lawyer. Like he went through basically the Ivy League system. But he's, I would say, somebody who probably is closer to our position ideologically. But then you have this kind of like nativist, revanchist wing as well, which is sort of like we need to go back to like the core American identity. And I think that's much more of like a nationalist kind of view. So, I mean, I think I guess it depends on your interpretation of winning. Is it like kind of we need to protect our kind of like cultural identity, or do we need to be competitive as a global economy and military power? I think those two things are like kind of distinguishable in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where it gets into the bad part of not really having an ideology is he also has this sort of sense, as far as I can tell, that economics is win-lose. It's either we're winning or they're winning. And so it is a zero-sum kind of approach to economics, at least as far as I've been able to glean. But I also think maybe people have sometimes make too much of that. But on the whole, just to get back to the is it good or bad? I think it is probably on balance, I think, slightly better than what Kamala would have been. But I think it's also certainly more volatile. I think it is more unpredictable. So the variance of how good or bad it can go is definitely higher. Whereas I think under Kamala, it may have much less variance, but definitely a lower high.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that it's kind of the free stool, three-legged stool is replaced with the one-legged stool about are you pro-woke or anti-woke. For me, that would kind of, other than Ross Ulbricht, and I've said before that I think that if you freeze Ross, then basically I'm happy. I think that it's better than Kamala, because she certainly wouldn't have. But other than that, this has to mean something in the fight against wokeness. Now, there is a little bit of a rise of a woke right, which I think is terribly unfortunate, but it's very discernible. But at least as far as the war against the woke left, this would need to mean something. And the first Trump administration didn't really mean anything. It didn't stop, and in many ways it probably exacerbated the degree to which wokeness became a cultural phenomenon. And my initial signs, I must say, it seems like wokeness has been dealt a blow. It seems like there's a lot of these DEI offices, not just in America, but maybe even around the world, being closed. And lots of places are saying, we hire based on merit alone. Of course, we in South Africa have not seen any of the...
we're lagging a little bit.
Hopefully we're just lagging and that we're not completely cut off from those benefits. But to me, that would be if he succeeds not just in having a good 4 years, but in doing things that really break the back of this very insidious cultural phenomenon, or at least just providing the impetus for that to carry on, then I think that would be a victory. Certainly, Kamala Harris wouldn't have done that. I don't think she's necessarily woke prime. I think she does whatever she feels she needs to do, but she wouldn't have done anything to kind of make it any better. So yeah, forget about economics, forget about policy. If the kind of in your faceness of Donald Trump and the movement he's building does some damage to global wokeness, then I think on balance that's probably a good thing.
Because that is a cultural phenomenon, and that is running rampant through so many institutions, and which also questions the fundamental basis for freedom, really. I mean, like if you think of some of the revisionist history around the founding fathers, and that the whole kind of idea of America is somehow institutionally racist or prejudiced, I think that's hugely damaging, because the principle of freedom undergirds that idea of America. So I think that's very persuasive for me.
Yeah, and I don't think those are the cultural stuff and the economic stuff are as easily separable as one might think, because a lot of those, like David was sort of alluding to there, a lot of those things are related to one another. So if you've got a sort of cultural wokeness, that also means that will eventually find itself within economic policy. So whether that be on the environment, whether it be on DEI, or those are the three things: is your environment, social, and governance, the ESG things. So there definitely is a large extent to which those cultural factors also have an economic effect. And one thing that I definitely think Trump is significantly better on is energy policy, which is definitely the case that more energy is better for everyone. It was some years ago, but I do remember that reading at one point that energy production is almost the one thing that you can correlate directly to GDP almost, or that correlates best with GDP almost anywhere you look in the world. So if you're producing more energy, your economy is growing, whether it's a growing economy and energy catching up, or whether it's energy, you're just producing more energy, and then the economy sort of grows to catch up to the amount of excess energy, surplus energy you've generated. But that's definitely a very positive sign, is that, and also in terms of the geopolitics, it's just because in Europe there has been a increasing reliance upon what we now know to be foreign adversaries, Russia and so forth. But so there definitely is a need for the superpowers, if not for ourselves, to become less, or to become more energy independent and less dependent upon, adversarial regimes.
Do you think that Trump's kind of approach to energy would change something with the Europeans? I don't think the US has really had an energy issue. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me, but the Europeans certainly have been since the war in Ukraine started. So I'm wondering, maybe Trump's better stance on energy is less relevant for his own country, given that they seem to have abundant energy already. But maybe in that geopolitical sense that you mentioned, it could actually push Europe to being a little bit more sensible on energy. What do you guys think? Is that something that, I mean, the European Union obviously doesn't like Donald Trump. I think that's clear. But would this have an effect? I mean, he's good on NATO, trying to force them to up their military contributions, their budget contributions, which is awesome. But on energy, what do you guys think?
I'll just quickly, and then David can say his part as well. But I think the main thing with energy is, if you've got a superpower like America producing significantly more energy, not only is there more energy in the global environment, so there's a greater availability of that sort of, and whatever, if, like I said, economics aren't zero sum. So if the American economy is doing very well, then everybody will be doing very well. But the other factor there is just that you almost necessarily decrease the power of a lot of those regimes that are very dependent upon oil and gas exports to fund their governments. So if you think of Iran or Russia,
Venezuela,
Venezuela, a lot of those OPEC countries, amongst others, which they sort of rely on the price of oil staying relatively high. If you've got a massive producer coming into the market, ramping up the production, then you take the teeth out of a lot of those regimes, which is why it's weird, sort of, that Trump's often seen as the lackey for a lot of those bad actors.
Yeah, I think I agree with Morné. I think also having a counter narrative to Europe's obsession with carbon neutrality and net zero. I mean, like Miliband in the UK is going full tilt on net zero. And I mean, I think that the costs of lack of available energy are just so significant. It's not just like how you measure that in GDP per capita. It leads directly to deprivation in people's lives, and desperate poor people will do anything to get hold of the resources that they need, right? So I think that will create a lot of social instability as well. And we're already seeing in the UK kind of hurtling down a spiral, like a death spiral at the moment. And yeah, so I think, kind of puncturing that narrative and saying, okay, well, actually, securing your base energy needs is critical for a modern economy. Like it is the foundation for industrialization and all of the things that we take for granted. And here in South Africa, we've got a really good example of when we have energy scarcity, just how damaging that can be. I mean, if you just look at the erosion of our industrial base. So I think, I was quite amused when he was talking about RFK Jr., who's another one of those members of the Broad Alliance. Who would have thought that the kind of Kennedy dynasty would have been absorbed into the Republicans under Trump, of all people? And how he said, I said to RFK, you can do what you want on the food, on all the toxic chemicals in our food, but just don't touch the oil. It's the black gold. But yeah, I mean that like even just that statement reveals the paradox of Trumponomics, right? Like he's quite happy to have some food czar who's going to be dictating what kind of stuff I mean, I've seen some of these kind of Trump advocates talking about how they want to ban seed oils, and I think it's probably a good idea to limit your seed oil consumption, but that's like weaponizing kind of regulatory authorities, to kind of achieve some kind of desired outcome. It's like not really that libertarian. So in a way, it's kind of odd that someone like RFK is part of the Republicans, but also sort of makes sense. There's a kind of interventionist streak within Trump's kind of idea of economics. Deviated from energy, but I'm also fairly optimistic that he'd be quite bullish on nuclear energy as well. And I mean, if you watch that interview that Trump was on with Joe Rogan before the election, he had some very valid points about the destructiveness of green energy solutions like wind and solar. Like one of the points that he made was that it has all of these offshore wind farms have a big effect on whales, that actually it causes like tremors within the ocean that disrupts their equilibrium, and they end up having like dozens of whales being beached on the shore. And not to mention birds and other things. So actually it's kind of interesting, like the so-called green agenda is very obsessed with carbon emissions, but not really with other environmental effects like wildlife conservation. It's all that's it's just a means to a greater end of reducing carbon. But like, why is it that it has this obsession over carbon specifically?
Yeah,
well, I mean, it's also just opposed to anything that works. So, I mean, nuclear power reduces carbon emissions significantly, but it works very well. So therefore, they must be against that as well. So it's it's a bit of a self-imposed paradox.
Yeah, I mean, didn't we see that in Germany? At the just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is Germany had these issues with they not being able to import the Russian gas from Russia, natural gas from Russia anymore, and they were in an energy crunch. And a lot of these environmental organizations, when they heard that government was, or the German government was considering reinstating or developing nuclear facilities, they revolted and they said, no, wait. If you want a short-term solution, just fire up the coal again. Just we've got these coal mines. Let's get those coal mines going again.
Yeah.
So it's not even just a anti-carbon kind of thing. It's almost a please don't solve this issue kind of thing. I mean, that's, I think, probably the main opposition to nuclear is it solves the problem that a lot of people have made a living off of complaining about.
Yeah, I guess a part of it is also, and I mean, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but this degrowth agenda thing, this idea that actually human beings we're not part of nature, we're kind of a blight on an external blight on the surface of the planet, and nuclear actually is very uniquely suited to allow exponential economic growth. Like if everyone just had nuclear power plants around the world, then yeah, it's almost free energy. We have one of the biggest uranium deposits in South Africa in the world, and that could just power us for thousands of years. And then it takes energy almost off the table, and now we can move on to the next thing. And then that ultimately that's the opposite of degrowth. That is huge. That opens up huge growth for Africa specifically, the fastest growing population in the world. And that seems that might be maybe an underlying reason why the left is so opposed to nuclear, because they know solar and wind and so on, they're sufficient for kind of keeping things going, but actually ultimately they're a handbrake. They're a constraint on huge growth. So I mean that might actually be one of the underlying considerations that a lot of these people have.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if the French can do it, I mean, the French have a significant percentage of their energy production is through nuclear. So, I mean, if they can do it, surely everyone can. But I think that might be part of it. But I think a large part of it is also just what's that? I think it's a Thomas Sowell quote where he says, it's very difficult to get someone to understand something when their job depends on them not understanding it. And I think that's a lot of this is you've got, I mean, it would be hard to really estimate, but it's definitely in excess of $1 trillion industry dedicated to all these NGOs dedicated to keeping the issue on the table. And it's a weird thing in politics is that people are often incentivized not to solve issues. Once an issue is solved, then you're sort of the dog that caught the car, and now it's off the table. You sort of saw that with the Republicans when Roe v. Wade got overturned. It was a really nice thing for them to campaign on, and it's something that they could really get their base jazzed up about. And when it was actually overturned, they didn't really know what to do about it, and they didn't really expect to win. And and I think something like immigration is the same in America, in the US, where both parties actually rely on immigration being an issue. So it's not going to get solved if there's no incentive for either of the two parties to really solve it.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it's interesting. It seems like now abortion is going to become the issue for the Democrats. So they had this victory for decades, and now the Supreme Court took that away, apparently. But it's not like the Biden administration adopted federal abortion legislation that would allow abortion on the same basis as Roe v. Wade. In theory, they could have done that. A lot of people say that the Supreme Court threw it back to the states. They didn't, because there's still the supremacy clause of federal law in the Constitution still applies. If Congress passes pro-abortion, pro-choice legislation, it could do that. But they didn't do that because it's going to be an issue for the Democrats to keep campaigning on, to say that, oh, look at the anti-women's rights thing that the Republicans have done, and their Supreme Court appointees are these fascists. So vote for us so we can reverse that. And they know that this is going to be the gift that keeps on giving. So that, I mean, my sense is almost that that's how it's going to be playing out for the next few decades, at least, on abortion.
Yeah, I think so. Although there's less of it than I would have thought at the moment. I wonder whether it's not almost sort of approaching a kind of tentative equilibrium where. But one thing I did notice is that, I mean, you said that it has sort of informally been devolved to the states. And it's a weird thing where I thought that's what everyone wanted. I mean, not everyone, obviously. Some people do want federal legislation. But I was convinced that the call was always that, the decision was bad. This shouldn't operate at the level of a constitutional right. You shouldn't have, 9 justices making a decision on behalf of 330 million people. You should have a state-by-state regime, which I thought was the ideal everybody wanted, but it seems to have upset a lot of people. I don't know. There are very few people. In fact, I'm not sure if I've heard of anybody that's been satified with the new status quo. But
I would have also thought it would be a good compromise. Yeah, I also would have thought it would have been a good. I would have thought it would have been a good compromise. You chaps hearing my mic?
Yes,
okay?
yeah.
Is it, yeah. And but I mean, I think it was very telling how the Democrats really just completely misrepresented Trump's position during the elections. I mean, I thought Obama didn't exactly cover himself in glory by doing that, kind of insinuating that Trump's going to take away your abortion rights. I mean, I suppose some of the diehard pro-lifers would say it's not really a question for people to really be voting on, that it's kind of a issue of fundamental rights. But I mean, it is a morally ambiguous issue. I mean, because there's also the rights of the mother to decide.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. But then you have both extremes, and I don't say extremes necessarily in a negative sense, but both extremes see it as a fundamental rights issue. So the left extremists see it as a fundamental right of the mother to decide about her body, and on the right, the extremists think it's a fundamental right to the life of the fetus. So yeah, it's quite interesting. So both of those extremes would want federal legislation or a Supreme Court precedent, whereas everyone not on the extremes are like, okay, we can have a pragmatic solution, I guess. And yeah, I mean, I'm still not quite sure whether I'm an extremist or a pragmatist on this question. It's a tough one for libertarians.
Yeah, but as a jurist, Martin, what do you think of this, of the kind of the legal question of, because Roe versus Wade in some ways went beyond the scope of the original Constitution in terms of creating this privacy right.
Well, yeah, I thought Roe versus Wade was good law. So a lot of people disagree with me on this. But if you take an originalist view on the U.S. Constitution, or an original original meaning perspective on the U.S. Constitution, then you have to do a historical study. You need to ask, what did people understand by these constitutional rights when they were adopted at the time? What was the original meaning? That's originalism in the U.S., and that's what this court, the current bench, ostensibly is. And to me, Roe versus Wade, despite being associated with progressivist activist politics, was an originalist judgment. They did all of the things that you need to do to arrive at an originalist conclusion. They did the historical study. They asked, what did people understand by their right to due process? And I think where Roe versus Wade fell flat was that it found the right to privacy somehow in this right to substantive due process, when in fact it should have found it in either the 9th or the 10th Amendment. I think the 9th Amendment says that just because a right is written in the Constitution does not mean the existence of other rights is being denied. So the enumeration of rights does not exclude the existence of other rights. And what these other rights were to the founding fathers was the natural rights that is associated with the common law and so on, the right to liberty, basically, fundamentally. That's what the people at the time would have understood by rights retained by the people in the language of the 9th Amendment. And then the 10th Amendment says that any power not given to the federal government resides with the people or with the states. So if I were the court in Roe versus Wade, I would have said, listen, the people at around the time of the adoption of the Constitution would have understood that an individual has control of their body. It's the kind of fundamental right. And it's not for us to decide whether this extends to abortion or privacy or whatever, but just that this is the right, that this is what they would have understood their right as encompassing, as control over your body. And that's how I would have come to the same conclusion. I don't know why they came up with this privacy thing. I think privacy is a right retained by the people, but I wouldn't have found it in substantive due process. So I think there it's a little bit odd. But in other respects, it's a historical inquiry by the court, as they should have done, something that courts don't do anymore. So I thought that was very good on the part of the court. So yeah, I've always thought that Roe versus Wade was basically good law. I haven't read the new judgment. But yeah, I mean, I would have personally, I would have been happy if Roe versus Wade was still binding precedent. So,
Morné, do you think we should nominate Martin to the Supreme Court of the United States based on analysis?
I think what we think of the matter really doesn't matter.
But, it's a very diplomatic answer. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah. But Martin, you sort of mentioned the historical analysis. You don't really think that a single founding father would have thought that the right to your body would have extended to abortion, do you?
I don't think their intention mattered. So that's whether they thought that that's how it should work or not, I think is irrelevant. And that's why I think there's the distinction between original meaning and original intention. So it's about, it doesn't matter what you want. It's like, if you are a 17th century statesman and you bought into John Locke's, as I think they did, John Locke's idea of every person as a fundamental ownership in himself that no one else has access to, then yeah, that's how you understood liberty, the rights retained by the people, and the implications of that. It doesn't really matter whether you agree with it or not. That's how you fundamentally have to understand it. So yeah, I think it goes without saying that I don't even know if there were such a thing as abortions in those days, but to the extent that they exist, I'm sure most people would have disagreed very fundamentally with it. But if you read the language of the 9th Amendment...
They'd have made your argument and said, well, you've got this protection of life, and clearly the Constitution intended for that protection of life to also extend to the... well, I'm not sure whether they would have said living or not living, but
so that would be the
I
debate.
think in any case, the weird part, and that's why it's funny that you said the extremes, because the extremes are really just the only people being consistent on the matter. If you're being logically consistent, you're likely going to end up on one of the two extremes.
Yes.
Because the weird compromise, and that's where I think it gets completely away from a constitutional originalist interpretation. The trimester compromise is that was invented out of whole cloth. I mean, there's no legal or constitutional argument for why you have to have the 3-act pregnancy sort of thing, where first trimester you've got basically full freedom, second trimester a little bit limited, third trimester very limited, which is basically
that
what we
was
have in
policy
South
making.
Africa as well.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so that was the court making policy. So I would agree that on that score, probably not great. But yeah, I can see what they were doing. I think if the court said, oh, okay, no, there's a right to privacy, so up until a minute before birth, you can kind of stab the baby, the fetus, and that's okay. I think the court was trying to compromise there, and that's what all courts do, and they shouldn't. I think I agree that they certainly should follow the law as they see it to its logical conclusion. But yeah, I think that's probably what they did. They were kind of conscious of, we can't be too radical on this, otherwise the judgment would be completely delegitimized. But yeah, I agree. I think I agree with you. The extremes. That's why I said I'm not associating a negative with the use of extreme here. I think a lot of people nowadays, if you talk about extremists, it's like, they're bad guys. It's like, well, if you're an anti-rape extremist, I think you're probably better than an anti-rape pragmatist. So I think the extremes probably have, one of the extremes has the right answer. Which one it is, to me, is a difficult question to answer. Just because, as you say, there's this, and I think that should have been the debate between the fundamental right to life and the fundamental right to control over your own kind of body. I think there is a conflict between these, and I think there is a conflict between many other rights as well. Well, not a conflict, a tension that should be resolved. But then it became this whole discussion about trimesters and when is viability there, and when is it about your right to privacy, or it's like, I mean, that kind of muddied the waters. But yeah, I still think that as far as methodology goes, Roe versus Wade was it followed the right legal philosophical methodology. It wasn't an activist court, other than the policy making on trimesters. But yeah, I think that's now normal, at least. Certainly in South Africa, the courts love engaging in stuff like that. But yeah,
like
it's
certainly on the bench, basically.
Yes. So yeah, they pretend that they don't. Our courts enjoy saying that they're deferring to the expertise of the executive and the legislature, but when it's let's be honest, if it's a leftist issue, if it's something that's close to transformationist dogma, then the court will very clearly sit and tell the government exactly what it needs to do now, or it will tell the private sector exactly what needs to happen in fine detail. If it's something that's maybe a little bit more technical, or something that's related to payment systems and something that judges don't necessarily have too much interest in, then they would say, we'll give Parliament time to come to a kind of a structured response to this. So it's as Dr Malan would always say, it kind of depends on your proximity to the core of transformationist dogma. The closer you get to it, the more the courts in South Africa become almost like a clergy. They're the high priests of transformationism, and they will tell you exactly where you're sinning and where you're being virtuous. And the further away you move from it, the more they become proper judges, as we would want them to be.
Transformation with a capital T. Yeah?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that sort of makes it hard in South Africa to really develop a very functional, or maybe not functional, but desirable legal jurisprudence. Just because, I mean, in the US, you've got, this very, very aggressive, very energetic call for originalism. What was the intent of the original drafters of the Constitution?
The meaning, not the intent.
Yeah, sorry, the meaning.
Meaning, yeah.
But in South Africa, it's sort of more difficult just because the actual content of the constitution has become, the colored. It has this. Everybody's looking through ANC colored glasses. What's it? The blue? No, sorry, the yellow, black, and green glasses that we're all looking at the constitution through. And in that sense, it's very difficult to really say what would you like, or how would you like the courts to approach those sort of fundamental constitutional questions, just because the default starting point for a lot of the judiciary is that we have this very particular understanding of the constitution. If you just take, for example, the word transformation doesn't appear in the constitution, and yet I think if you sort of polled judges in South Africa, they tell you that, well, it might not appear, but it's definitely at the core of the constitution.
Yes.
Which makes it difficult. I mean, what would a desirable jurisprudence look like in South Africa, Martin? Just solve the entire judiciary for us quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's
PhD discussions about.
so this is what the what my PhD is about. Yeah, so it's, and the thing that solves the issue, and then I guess I'm trying to provide a very simple answer to a complex question, is judges have to be immersed in what I would say is the tradition of constitutionalism. So what is constitutionalism always meant, even to the leftists and to the rightists who have opposed the idea of constitutionalism? They have said that the idea that the state must be limited by written law is offensive to us. We do not want it. That was the whole issue with the Nazis in Germany. Their jurists and their thinkers, they said that, listen, stop talking to us about written law. Leave us alone. The word of the Führer is law. We do not care for written law, and they understood, and that's why the Nazis didn't legislate much at all, is because they understood that the act of writing down what they want to do already limits them, because now it's written down, and now they're going to be measured against whatever is written. So if they want to do more, and if they think that there's a cost associated with doing more and they want to do less, then they can't do it. So that's why people who are interested in tyranny always prefer just doing arbitrarily what they want. So constitutionalism is necessarily the act of writing down the limits of government and being bound by those limitations. There's no such thing as an unlimited government where there is constitutionalism, whether that is North Korea or Eritrea. The moment they write it down, there is a nominal appeal to constitutionalism, and they are, at least on paper, acting unlawfully and incorrectly. So if you want to be a tyrant, don't write it down. Now, the issue in South Africa is we have stuff written down, and as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think any good jurist is concerned, that means we have formally limited government. And that means that if the word transformation does not appear, and other words do appear in the Constitution, like freedom appears many times in the Constitution.
Non-racialism.
Exactly, yeah, especially non-racialism. The word is there, and therefore you must treat it as being there. And you cannot have this nebulous concept that you've developed outside of the Constitution now overriding that. That is necessarily anti-constitutionalist. And that's what I think is the correct approach. But as Morné said, we have a very impoverished constitutional discourse in South Africa. And Morné and I often discuss how amongst Afrikaners specifically, there's a very positivistic legal attitude. But I think that applies to everyone in South Africa who thinks about law to any big degree. It's like, well, okay, yes, we would have preferred that our constitution wasn't socialist, but the courts have essentially said that it is, so we have to go with it. That is
the law.
Exactly. So you'll hear that even from conservative attorneys and advocates. If you go to them and you say, listen, we have to argue that BE is unconstitutional because it's racialist, and Section 1B of the Constitution says non-racialism, they'll be like, nice, but the court has said this. Look, here is paragraph the court has said that. The answer that the Americans would give is, well, the court is wrong, and we are now going back to court to tell the court how wrong it is and why it's wrong, and we want them to change. And if they're still wrong, it's fine. We'll come back next year, and we'll come back next year and keep telling the court how wrong it is. In South Africa, you can almost see the advocate or the attorney cringing when you tell them, listen, we have to go and tell the Constitutional Court that its jurisprudence is simply incorrect. It is incompatible with the written text of the Constitution. They would say, listen, we're going to lose, and we can't do that. It's like, well, yes, we are going to lose, and we're going to lose a few times, and eventually we're going to win a bit, and then we're going to win a bit more, and eventually we're going to get what we want. But we never get to that point because we just have this very different legal culture from the US. The US is a creative legal culture. You have the living constitutionalism types. They make their arguments in the law journals. They make their arguments in courts. Then you have the originalists. They make their arguments in the law journals, and they make their arguments in the court. Sometimes they win. Sometimes they lose. It's a constant kind of dialectic battle that ends up with a synthesis at some point, which is completely absent in South Africa. There's nothing like it here. We have one perspective being argued, and we have it's transformationism being argued, and we have conservative lawyers saying, that sucks, but we're actually now going to have to accept the premise that they've laid for us and keep. So we are developing law, but it's always in the direction or on the premises laid by the transformationist ideology.
Yeah, and I think that you said that the US has a more creative legal culture. I think it also has a more collaborative legal culture. There is the sense that you can influence policy, and policy has to sort of account has some responsibility or some accountability to the people. And that's seen as a very, very legitimate argument in the US is this runs counter to the will of the people, or even to the will of a particular subset of the people. But beyond that, there is the sense that everybody feels as though they have a very legitimate cause upon which they can act. Whereas in South Africa, there really isn't this culture. In South Africa, it's not just that we've got policy developing along one track. We've also got policy originating from only one place. Whereas in the US, you have policy almost coming from the outside towards Congress. So a lot of legislation in the US, I'd say probably the vast majority of legislation in the US isn't actually drafted by Congress people. It's drafted by, and I mean, they research it and they have people that work for them. So it's not as though they're just rubber stamping something that they got from outside, at least not always. But there's just a very different culture in the US where there's an expectation as a congressperson, so the equivalent of a parliamentarian in South Africa, that yes, you're going to be the one who eventually votes on legislation, but your job isn't fundamentally to draft legislation. Your job is to find out what your constituency wants and to fight amongst other people to get that done. And in South Africa, it's just an entirely different scenario where there's just no real engagement beyond, and that's why the courts are so important in South Africa, is because it's almost the only way for outside parties to really attempt to influence policy. And we've got these sort of things on paper where you have to deliver comments, or you have to take part in public hearings and those sorts of things. I mean, it's kabuki theater. It means absolutely nothing. It's really just ticking a box and making sure that we've complied with the formal requirements of legislation. But there really isn't this very strong collaborative legal sense where parliamentarians will approach think tanks or industry or any real constituency to say, okay, what are the issues troubling you? We'd like your insights. How do we solve this? We're going to write a bill. And yeah, or even just sometimes it's not even from that direction. Sometimes the impetus comes from the constituency or from the community, and they say that, look, this is something you have to pass. And if there's enough pressure on that legislator, they will pass it. Whereas in South Africa, there really is a huge lack of engagement. It's just, we've decided this, and we're in charge. So tough.
Yeah. What do you attribute that to? Is that institutional design? Is that legal system or culture, politics? Why do you think that's the case?
I would say it's culture. I think it's the ANC's centralist culture that has it's not just the ANC's anymore. I think it has infected every other party, and I make no exception there. Is this idea that, well, we are now in government or we're in parliament as an opposition party, and therefore it's over to us. You've handed us the buck or the mandate. It's ours now, so go away. And we're exactly, and then I think that's entirely political culture. So it's almost a conventional, like in the British sense, a convention. The understanding of democracy or politics here is that your participation as a citizen is the election, and the second that is over, you are neutralized and nullified as a political actor, and then it's over to us. Whereas, as Morné said, in the US, it's a constant conversation between the government and the people. So you go to your congressman, and I think it's not impossible to send an email to a congressman and to get a response. Whereas I think here it's relatively difficult. And if they agree, kind of basically with your concerns, they would do something about that. Even if they think they'll lose the vote. There was Thomas Massey, the only Republican voting against the nomination of Johnson as Speaker. He lost, and he knew he was going to lose, and it's okay. Like you should be losing something. Now in South Africa, if you take an idea that is going to lose to, let's call it, a nominally liberal party, and you say, hey, you have to do something about this, and they think, well, this can't get passed, then nothing is going to get done about it. If you go to a provincial government that should be more in favor of liberty, and you're like, hey, get rid of this restrictive alcohol policy or something, they're like, the X will not accept that. Some other force will not accept that, therefore we won't do it. That's at least the reason they give. Maybe there's another reason for why they're not actually doing that. So it's almost a disinterest. Morné, I think a few weeks ago or a few months ago in the office, you pointed out there is the sense of dismissal of taxpayers, for instance, by the government. It's like it's almost an anti-citizen, anti-taxpayer perspective. For if a taxpayer says, well, geez, come and cut the grass in my suburb, the government almost goes out of its way to dismiss you and to say you are being selfish. How dare you say that we must come and cut the grass in your suburb? Or how dare you say we must fix this pothole or that pothole? You would never, I mean, you might see that in the US sometimes, but not at this scale, that some congressman is now laying into his constituents for daring to say that something must be fixed. It's normal here. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's at least a expectation, and I don't think it's just the US, so we're sort of praising the US, but I think it's almost the norm. I think we're actually the outlier here. But I think the norm in the rest of the world is that there's an expectation that you'll at least pay lip service to the idea that you're giving value to taxpayers. You know, that you're forcibly taking this money from people, taking it out of their paychecks, and in South Africa, in numerous other ways as well, taxing us. But you feel obliged as someone in government to at least feign some sort of, oh, we're doing this for our value, and we've done this, and you need us for that. Whereas in South Africa, there's a culture that they take your tax money and they sort of berate you for the fact that, what were you doing with this anyway? That's our money.
No, I mean, yes, it's exactly that. It's like you're giving us some of our money, essentially, and then that must always go up. So you're right.
We almost have to apologize for the percentage that we're allowed to hold. We sort of have to explain to government, look, you're taking X percent, and sorry for me keeping my own bit, but
I am but a miserable serf.
I
apologies,
promise I'll try to take part in the economy, and maybe that will create jobs and
I shall thresh more wheat next season.
And I mean, you actually touch on something here. We were asking earlier about Trump and his policy in the US, his economics, and this is an American culture thing rather than Trump specifically, but maybe Trump would get it back there in the sense that making money and being enterprising is actually a good thing. Being wealthy is not something to be ashamed of, and like in Elon Musk's case, again, it's like building big rockets and polluting as they go up into space. That's a good thing. We want that. It's a wonderful human achievement. Whereas in South Africa, the idea of enterprising is, to put it kind of at its most benign, is looked at askance and with some trepidation, when in fact actually it's seen as evil. And the business agrees that it's evil, which is the most shocking. I mean, I have Ayn Rand here over my shoulder. She would roll over in her grave if she saw how South African business were so self-flagellating. It's like
was it Rand who said that thing about nobody's worse at defending capitalism than the capitalists or something.
Yeah, like probably. That. Yeah, it's the sense of, wow, we've made all this money. Oh goodness, we must now give back to the community. It's like you made the money because you were giving back to the community. That's why you made the money. Like think through it.
The community rewarded you.
Yeah,
I do think a sense of charity, and that's maybe where Rand fell short. I think people.
Agreed.
Do have a sense of voluntary altruism, but I think Rand's great insight is like often this, like proclaiming yourself as this kind of benevolent altruist. It's often a mask for some other kind of sinister motive, and that people sort of like use this moral posturing as a way to get what they want, and they're actually very selfish. But I think voluntary charity is very important, especially where everyone's clamoring for the state to fix this problem and that problem.
Yes.
I don't see it as necessary that the state has to be the ones running the orphanages or the soup kitchens. That can be done by churches or community groups or whatever.
I think we would approve of business being more charitable if they said, oh, geez, we've made all this money, we feel very bad, so we're going to establish a whole university. We're going to establish a whole new schooling group for low-income kids or for free. I think that would be awesome. But what do they do instead? They're like, okay, let's work with government. They're always working with government to try and find ways to do these things that they can just do it themselves. And they
implicitly they feel like they need to atone for earning profits.
Yes.
For committing the sin of making profits.
Yeah. I mean, there's a mining company that I run past their head office in Sandton every now and then, and it says, "Beyond mining, going beyond mining." And like I thought, there's a kind of an apologetic tone there. It's like that we're not just miners; like we do other good stuff, But mining is very important for achieving all of the things that we need in this modern economy. Anyway, chaps, I need to hop off, but thanks. This is a great inaugural pod.
Absolutely.
Okay. I really liked just riffing with you guys and looking back on the week. And
here's to next week. Thanks, David. Yeah.
Stay free,
Okay.
everyone.
I think we need a more irreverent tagline than even that.
Yes,
Russian.
and we'll find one. But yeah, and Morné and I will probably start wrapping up soon.
All right, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Right, cheerio, David. Have a good one. Yeah, no, it's the thing with like it's fine if you feel you need to apologize for making money. I think if you have some condition.
My thing is just there's no equivalent sense from politicians.
Well, of course,
to me,
of course.
There seems to be something almost inherent in humans that they feel if they've made a lot of money, they need to justify that by referencing some sort of external good. So in the process of making this money, I have generated some other good, which is the case in any way. But there's another sense where they feel they have to, with reference to something entirely exogenous. So it's not just that creating jobs or fulfilling needs or anything like that. It's it allows me to donate to these charities or something like that, or we invest in these corporate social projects or something like that. But that's almost to me kind of a universal thing. But to me, the main issue is that there just doesn't seem to be any equivalent obligation or sense of obligation on the part of politicians, where they feel they have to sort of say, look at me, I'm lucky, I get a blue light brigade and a massive salary and all these things.
But everything they do is civil service. I mean, their whole existence is about serving the public, Morné. I mean,
yes.
That's how they would justify it to themselves. But I mean, what you've identified, I think it seems to go far back in human history. It seems like there's always been this sense of the merchant is somehow bad, or at least as virtuous as the other classes of society. And maybe there is not a solution to that. Maybe there is something in our instincts as humans to say that actually we should feel bad about that. Logically, I don't think that's right, but maybe there's some intellectual thing that we can't solve. But for me, the thing that I don't get is that, so okay, you're now you're guilty for being successful. Great, fine. Why do you jump from there to say I must now work with the government to solve education, rather than saying I must use my great wealth to solve the education crisis? That is where I think one must kind of look at what the solution is. Okay, yes, great. You're beyond mining, you suck, you're destroying the world, whatever. So use this money now and build schools, build universities, build clinics, build houses. Do it. Just do it. And stop saying we're working with the government to do that. Like, you can do it better than the government. You can deliver more goodies as an atonement for your sin. So, and that's I guess to a large degree that's the model in the US. Maybe I'm really not that familiar with how it works in the US, but I don't get the sense that whenever there's corporate social investment, it's through a government institution.
No, definitely not. I think there might actually even be certain limits upon that in the US, but certainly there isn't a culture of that. There definitely is a very, very robust culture of charity in America, and obviously in that case, I mean private charity. So private charitable donations, and also much greater, and I suppose this links up to both the legislation as well, a greater sense of community involvement, which extends to companies as well, which is companies feel they have to get involved in some way, and not just indirectly involved via engaging with the government. Whereas that does seem to be the beginning and the end of things in South Africa. Everybody has ceded both authority and responsibility to the government. They've sort of said, okay, that might actually be a question: is am I right about saying that? And
I think
if so, is it because they feel they're ceding the right because they don't want to, or they're ceding the right or ceding the responsibility because they almost feel like they can't legitimately claim it. It's like, oh no,
yes.
I can't get involved in that because that's the government. I'll just make a mess of it.
Yeah, so I think it's new in the sense that I think it's a characteristic of this constitutional era. I don't think it's always been like this in South Africa even. I think that maybe previously you had look at the missionary schools. It's not like the churches and the missionary societies were tripping over each other to get the colonial and the Republican governments to establish schools that they then pay for, like through the back door. It's like, no, we're going to start a missionary school and we're going to run it and we're going to pay for it. So this is a new thing, but I think that it is that sense of legitimacy, and maybe it has something to do with the call it the democratic principle that I think people have misconstrued, and especially in South Africa, this idea of democracy is so all-consuming, and businesses think, and I mean the chattering classes also think, that democracy can only be measured in political elections. In that, okay, the ANC government or the ANC party with its manifesto on social development has received this democratic mandate, therefore they have to do that. And because we think that that's virtuous, we have to help them and we have to fund them, and we're guilty for making too much money, so we have to fund that. But I mean, I think what we know as free marketeers is that actually the market is a more democratic system than voting. I mean, it's significantly more, because voting is every 5 years, and the market system has a vote every minute of every day. And it's if you've made a lot of money, if you are what's the biggest private company in South Africa? It's probably
Naspers.
Yeah, and I mean that gets millions of votes every month from South Africans, and then various other companies get millions of votes from their constituency, their electorate, which is their clients, their customers. And this, I think we would say, must also in their minds create a sense of legitimacy. It's like, we represent these people. These people have picked us, and we actually now have a social basis upon which to do the investment things these corporate social investment things that we want, without going through the government. The government exists in its domain, and it's fine. We respect that, and they do what they do. But we also get to do this. And I don't think that democratic principle has translated. I mean, it's bizarre. These people are businessmen. They make a lot of money. They're very good at what they do. And somehow they just don't think that what they do is legitimized by their customers. I find that very bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, you'd think that. I mean, that maybe there's a little bit of it. Maybe I'm being a bit too pessimistic, but you'd think that someone like a medical scheme or someone like that should be able to say to government, you know what, we're not speaking on behalf of our entity. We're speaking on behalf of millions of people, millions of your constituency. And we're saying, we're going to protect them. We're not going to allow you to take away the service that they want from us. We've committed to providing them a service, and we don't want to allow people to interfere with our provision of that service. Which is, I mean, that's sort of I think they'd all have. They'd all pay lip service to the idea that it's a greater ideal and it's providing a benefit and all that. But when it comes to actually having that greater ideal be threatened, they don't really fall back on we're in the keep people healthy business, and we've dedicated our lives to keeping people healthy. So if you're going to propose NHI, we're going to fight it with all we've got, because this is why this is our calling in life. I think it's broadly just that people don't see themselves as legitimate political actors almost.
And it's hard. It's not just unfortunate. It's actually harmful, because if you look at stuff like EWC and some of the more kind of insidious proposals that have been made, you see these businesses actively throwing their customers under the bus. You see them like saying, okay, we're going to work with government on EWC, we're going to work with government on NHI, when if you're on a private medical aid, you don't have to be. We have universal healthcare in South Africa. You can just not be on it and go to the world-class state medical system. The fact that you are on a private medical aid in isolation means that you reject the state's healthcare system for whatever reason. And now the medical aid is going and saying, we're going to help the government nationalize us and get everyone back. So you're actively being undermined by your chosen commercial representative. And I think there's great harm in that. But I like the thing that changed my thinking around this was specifically around EWC. And this was when Ernst Roets was speaking to Parliament about opposing EWC. And obviously Parliament was very upset about that. They were like, what legitimacy does AfriForum have to come and say these things? And I think Ernst or someone else made the point on social media probably. It's like AfriForum had, I don't know, 200,000 members, say. And it's like, that's 5 parliamentary seats. And it's like, you can't just pretend that this doesn't matter, that they're representing sectional interests. Like, listen, you're all parliamentarians. You got into parliament with 40,000 votes. So if you're representing 40,000 South Africans, AfriForum is representing 200,000. How is that not legitimate? How is it not legitimate for Discovery with its however many clients to get involved in political discourse? How is it not legitimate? Who decided that the only way in which we measure social legitimacy is through a formalized vote? I mean, when was this decision made? It was certainly made in my absence, so it's very weird.
And that is definitely a South African thing. I wonder whether this isn't sort of a broader, almost a way of discussing or framing the actions of business people, is just to have them view their customers almost as their voters. They entrust whatever it is that they get from you, they entrust that to you. So if it's groceries or whatever it is, the fact that you've got 1 million people who want this service from you means that they're giving you your vote, giving you their vote.
They trust you on that topic.
So if you feel that there's something within that relationship being threatened, you should almost see yourself as a sovereign entity. You should treat the environment as we're a nation state. We are the nation of whatever, McDonald's people, and this is what we give people, and this is a actual social contract that we have between us and our customers. And if you try to interfere with that, we are going to be very forceful in the way that we resist that interference. And
it's constantly renewed. It's continuously renewed. That contract, like if you, let's say one of these businesses then says something political or whatever, does something political, and they get more money or they get the same amount of money, then that kind of legitimizes that conduct. Because you can just say, well, okay, I'm not happy with the politics of X, so I'm not going to provide them a custom anymore. Like that, what happened with Discam for a lot of people and various other companies. If you're not happy with their politics, you withhold your vote, i.e. you withhold your money. And that's a far more dynamic system than I would say our 5-yearly elections, because we don't. Once you voted in South Africa, that's a done deal. You don't have recall elections. So in a way, and I know it's a different kind of legitimacy, but in a way you could say that these companies or even membership-based associations have more legitimacy because it's renewed and it's revocable. It's immediately revocable if need be. whereas that doesn't exist in politics. So then the question is, where do politicians get off on this idea that they have a elevated state of legitimacy? And I mean, only libertarians and liberals ask this question, so I'm not oblivious to that fact. But it's an interesting thing to ponder. Where do they get this idea? Yes, the formal constitution says that, but so what? It's
Yeah, but it's a
relevant,
weird thing
but it's
where,
not all-encompassing.
the thing that I just don't get is the fact that there's no sense. I don't even think they see themselves when politicians in South Africa, I suppose, paint with too broad a brush or whatever. There's always exceptions, yada yada.
Feel free to paint with a very broad brush.
But I don't really get the sense that they even see themselves as representing people. They see themselves as having won a competition, and therefore, they get to do what they want, or at least in a particular sphere of society, they won, and you're not allowed to question it. And if you wanted it, then maybe you should have won. It's it's the sort of the Nina. You're just the kind of approach to politics where I'm in parliament, you aren't. That means I get to do what I want, and if you wanted to do what you want, then you should have been here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of where like the premises are uncritically accepted. So if someone is like, I'm in parliament, so I get to do what I want because I won the vote, a company must then reply, well, okay, in that case, we won the market competition. So if you want to regulate medical aids, I guess start a national health insurance Pty Limited, and then we can compete between my medical aid and your medical aid, and we see who wins. So if you want NHI that doesn't kind of work on a profit-based motive, then cool, more power to you. So I won here, you won in parliament, so I guess we're at an impasse. And that's what I would say must be the mentality of business. And I think in the US and maybe elsewhere, you have more of that. I don't think you have entirely that, but you have more of that. Listen, we think that the government's plan is kind of shit, and sometimes we're actually just going to outright resist it. But in South Africa, it's more like, we wrote a letter and we had a meeting with the minister and we expressed our misgivings, and the minister told us to go F ourselves. We kissed his feet and then we left. That's kind of the different kind of commercial culture, the commercial political culture, that I think is actually a problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, and you can see it in the outcomes as well, because when you do get in that scenario I feel like we're sort of referencing the US a lot, but it's just top of mind, I suppose. I suppose this is Trump's world now. But when you do see that sort of private sector resistance in the US, maybe even 90% of the time, the outcome is, okay, let's change provisions to account for these things you've identified. I can't really think of a scenario where that's happened in South Africa, where Parliament said we want to do X. There was a huge resistance to X, and they said, "Oh no, sorry." Because there's a presumption in the rest of the world that politicians aren't supposed to be experts on every single thing in the world. So there's this idea that politicians are representatives, and the main skill of a politician is to determine what it is that their constituency wants, and to communicate that to within the political realm. And at no point is there an idea that you're a politician, that must mean you're an expert on energy and health and education and all those sorts of things. The presumption is you're not an expert, but you have to make decisions. So get actual experts to inform those decisions, and then take that expert advice, take the will of your constituency, and somehow find a compromise with other people. That's a healthy political environment. In South Africa, you've got judge, jury, executioner. You've got the politician that's the expert on everything, and basically everybody hoping to question him is either illegitimate or suspect or
Obviously racist, but yeah.
Obviously racist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah, it's so yeah. I mean, it's malicious compliance because our government does pretend to do that. So with NHI, they also always said, yeah, we did consult about these issues and we made changes, but those changes are basically never actually the thing that was problematized. So it's like the problems are still there, but they kind of fixed some language somewhere, and it's like, oh, now we've now done it. It's like malicious compliance.
It's almost always the case, because I think actually in the NHI bill, some of it was gendered language was actually one of the changes they made, where there were sections where the language was gendered and deemed to be either sexist or I suppose transphobic or something like that. But those are the kind of changes that government's willing to make. That, and then, okay, if there's a very particular interest group that says, no, let's just make sure that we get our slice of the pie, they're willing to consider that. But on the whole, they're not really going to. It's not going to shape the policy. They're not going to. Why would they care about what the populace wants?
Yeah, no, it's entirely kind of, as you said, we won the competition, so we decide. But yeah, Dr. Morné Malan, we've done 90 minutes of this podcast, and I think that's probably a good place to stop and then pick it up again next week. Yeah, thank you, and thank you to everyone who has joined us probably after the fact. Thank you for watching this first go, and from next week and going forward, we definitely would want engagement from the audience as we carry on. So it's you can feel free to write your comments afterwards, but we would actually prefer it if you write your comments on whatever platform you're watching this as we chat and engage with us, and we'll certainly engage with you. So yeah, we're trying something new, and we're quite excited about it, and we hope you are too. But it's Friday the 17th of January, and we'll see you again next week. Cheerio.
Cheers.